My name is William Romano. I am a political science international affairs major at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm also the student program chair of the Conference on World Affairs. Today I'll be presenting you a panel on the U.S. friend or foe. In the last couple of years, we've seen a major shift in how the U.S. has been dealing with international affairs and policy. With the recent inauguration of President Biden, we'll see how the U.S. is looked at differently moving forward. I hope you enjoyed this panel from our esteemed panelists and moderator on this topic. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs. Thank you all for joining us in what I think will be an exhilarating virtual panel. Today is Friday, January the 21st, 2021. It is 9 a.m. And our panel's title is The United States Friend or Foe, a three-part series focused on international affairs during the next presidential administration. My name is Dr. Svet Derderian. I'm a professor at the Political Science Department at CU. My research largely focuses on the comparative politics of anti-corruption, as well as on the rise of international authority in global politics. At CU, I teach various classes on international politics and economic development. It is my great pleasure to serve as the chair of this panel. We have three esteemed panelists. Dr. Benedetta Berti is head of policy planning in the Office of the Secretary General at NATO. She is also associate researcher at the Institute for European Studies at Vrij Universiteit Brussels and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. An Eisenhower Global Fellow and a TED Senior Fellow in the past decade, Benedetta has held research and teaching positions at West Point, the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, among others. Her research focuses on armed groups, internal wars, and protection of civilians. Ambassador Hugo Lorenz is also joining us today. In his illustrious diplomatic career, he has served in key positions such as principal officer in Sydney, Australia, Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, Ambassador in Residence and Faculty Advisor at the National War College, US Ambassador to Honduras, Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in Madrid, Spain, and many others. Currently, he is engaged in international business and security affairs consulting, speaks to a variety of audiences on international affairs issues all over the world. And finally, Dr. Jamie Shea. Dr. Jamie Shea is a professor of strategy and security at the Strategy and Security Institute, University of Exeter, United Kingdom, and member of the group of strategic advisors of the NATO Special Operation Forces Command in Brussels. Prior to joining the University of Exeter, Dr. Shea was an international public servant and a member of the international staff of NATO for 38 years. His last NATO post was Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Outside NATO, Jamie Shea has been a professor at the College of Europe in Bruges and at the American University, Washington, D.C., as well as senior fellow at the London School of Economics. We're absolutely delighted and honored to have you here as guests. We will start in the following batting order. We'll start with the ambassador, followed by Benedetta, followed by Jamie. Each of you will take 5 to 7 minutes to make your initial remarks on the topic of the day. We'll then have a small discussion featuring questions that I have prepared, as well as questions submitted by the audience. I'm reminding the audience that they may submit questions to us all at any time during the session, either through the Zoom Q&A feature or on the YouTube chat. If you are a student, please let us know. Everybody, do feel free to share your location when you're sending a question. Without further delay, let's dive right in, and let's start with you, Ambassador Lorenz.
Thank you, Svetoslav. It's great to be with you and the University of Colorado, and thanks for putting this panel together. I know it's part of your conference on world affairs, so it's also good to be with Jamie and Benedetta, my distinguished colleagues. You know, in terms of, what I wanted to focus on is that in President Biden, I think unquestionably, the United States has elected one of the most experienced individuals as in terms of foreign policy that we've ever had. I mean, President Biden is up there with Richard Nixon and George H. Bush as someone with very, very strong foreign policy and national security background. And of course, this is a huge advantage coming off one of the least qualified presidents that we've had in modern American history in terms of foreign policy. As we all know, President Trump had little to no experience in foreign policy. He read very little and had a series of, personality issues that really made for a highly dysfunctional U.S. foreign policy. In President Biden, we have almost, the exact opposite. Biden not only knows the world, but he knows all the key actors. And he also has a lot of wisdom and perspective. And that comes from 50 years of experience. I mean, President Biden was elected to the Senate in 1972, so he has almost 50 years of continuous foreign policy experience. I had the honor of meeting Senator Biden back in the middle 80s. I was very much involved in the Central America crisis of the time, and Senator Biden was very much engaged on those issues, and he was quite expert on the whole Central American issue. Didn't agree with the Reagan administration, but he was an extremely thoughtful player at that time. And again, as vice president for during the Obama administration, he led numerous task forces, foreign policy task forces around the world. The other thing I would mention about President Biden is that he knows the bureaucracy. He understands how the U.S. interagency works, how the State Department relates to the Defense Department, the whole role of the intelligence community. So he knows our bureaucracy intimately. And of course, he also knows how to work with Congress. Coming out of the Senate, but he is someone who is very much a person who can cut deals. So I think he's going to be very much talking to both Republicans and Democrats on his foreign policy agenda. The other thing is, one of the things that you see is he's put together an exceptionally good foreign policy national security team. In Secretary.
So I'm not sure whether it is just me. Jamie and Benedetta, have we lost the ambassador for a second?
It looks like his internet has frozen. I'm not sure if he's had an internet.
These are the normal and expected challenges.
Yeah,
pandemic era. Zoom.
And it works perfectly well when you're doing the test, and then when you come to the real thing, factor X, right? Always.
Yeah, that's okay. We can afford to wait a few seconds, of course.
Am I back on?
Welcome back.
Good to be back. So anyway, we really don't have any major egos or personalities, but these are people, I've worked with all of them. I've had the opportunity of working with all of them, and these are people that are extremely collegial. They're very nice people. So you're going to have a very sort of copacetic national security team working for President Biden. And I think that'll be extremely important. In the past, you always have the rivalries between the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. You're not going to see that. I would also mention Bill Burns at the CIA, who is one of our most experienced career diplomats, and he'll bring a lot to the table in terms of restoring the credibility of the U.S. intelligence community. While this is all good news, I mean, we have an extremely able president on foreign policy, a great national security team. The bad news is that, President Biden is coming to office facing some very huge domestic crisis in the US. He has a triple crisis, dealing, as the rest of the world, with the COVID pandemic in America. Well, that is going to be his top priority. He's announced his vaccination plans for the first 100 days. He also, we're facing one of the worst economic crises that America has faced since the Depression, going back to the 1930s. So he's very much will be working with Congress on getting enacted a stimulus package. He's put on the table a $1.9 trillion stimulus package. And then, of course, you have these huge political divisions in America. We're facing in the next couple of weeks a Senate trial related to President Trump's impeachment. So it is a very, very complicated situation. So while, I'm sure the president will be very, very eager to engage on foreign policy, the reality is that domestic issues will consume him to a significant degree. Having said that, let me in 2 minutes mention, key issues on foreign policy. No doubt, you've seen some actions already, some executive actions the president has taken. Rejoining the Paris Climate Change Agreement, huge issue for President Biden and for his administration. And again, an opportunity for the US to provide some leadership. The president has also rejoined the World Health Organization. So the US is going to be very much looking at the COVID pandemic as a global issue that we all need to work together and cooperative. So those are two strategic priorities that you have seen right off the bat. And then, in the end of the day, it is about restoring America's relations with its allies. Principally, look at the European Union. It's restoring good relations with our most immediate neighbors. Notice that President Biden's first calls were to Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada and to President Lopez Obrador of Mexico. There is obviously trying to establish a relationship with China at a very difficult moment, very complex moment. There's a whole issue of re-engaging with our allies in Asia, Australia, Japan, South Korea. I would mention the issue of Afghanistan, where I served as ambassador. He has some important decisions to make early on regarding, supporting the ongoing peace process, but doing in a way that gives us a chance to actually achieve a sustainable peace. So that's a critical issue. There's a whole issue of the nuclear arms issue with Iran re-engaging on that. The Middle East will be big, but also Latin America. I think Central America, you have a situation where you have a number of countries that are virtually failed states. You have a Trump administration that ignored Latin America completely, except for the immigration issue. So the president will have to re-engage on Latin America.
Thank you, Ambassador, for these insightful remarks. Per our batting order, we'll proceed with Dr. Benedetta Berti.
Thank you, and it's a very broad topic. First, I'm very glad to be with you, albeit virtually, to give some perspective from Europe, and of course from where I'm sitting at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. So, what to say about the future of the transatlantic relations with a new U.S. administration at the beginning of a new dawn in a very complex security environment? And I would say that there is, from my perspective, there is a very strong reason to be optimistic about the future of the transatlantic relations. I think it is definitely true that over the past 4 years, questions have been asked on both sides of the Atlantic at times about our mutual commitment to each other. I also think that it's important to keep in mind that even though some of these questions have been asked, United States support for its transatlantic allies and for NATO has not wavered substantially if you look at a few indicators. For example, public opinion, which of course it's important, and even throughout the recent past and the different ups and downs at the political level, NATO has remained strongly popular amongst the US public. All the polls tell us that's the same, and what they tell us is also this is a strongly bipartisan issue, which is something that to me it's really important to highlight in what is sometimes a politically polarized environment. Nevertheless, support for a strong relations between the North America and Europe has remained a bipartisan issue. Similarly, of course, when you look at United States presence in Europe and defense spending and commitment to European security, I can also say that is also a trend where we haven't seen a withdrawal at all in the last few years. That said, we are now standing and looking at the future, and I think there is a good reason to believe that over the next few years, transatlantic relations will grow stronger, and we will do more together. And I think, given that I don't have much time, I would just like to explain, in my opinion, why that is the case. And I think the case is to summarize it in a very eloquent way. The Secretary General of NATO a couple of years ago had the honor of being the first international leader to address the US Congress, and by a bipartisan invitation, again, to highlight what I just said. And the gist of his speech was that NATO will continue to be popular and will continue to be supported in America because it is good to have friends. And I think that's really the bottom line when it comes to alliances. Why is it good to have friends? It's good to have friends because NATO for 70 years has basically stood by a very simple, very basic principle. That is, we're all in it together. An attack against one ally is an attack against all. And by the sheer fact of having continued to work together through 7 decades, we've built a powerful deterrence and defense that ultimately has kept us all safe for roughly 70 years, which is no mean feat if you consider the history of the world. So even as we look forward, I don't think we should ever forget the fundamentals, especially because this is an event where I think most of the audience is students, and I think that it's very important to think about the future, but it's very important to remember what we have achieved so far. So the reason why alliances still matter is still very much the same. It is much easier to deal with problems if you do it with friends, if you do it with other countries, if you do it together, than if you try to confront it alone. Now, I think that this is especially important if you look at the world in the next 10 years. We don't know what the future will bring, but there are a few things we do know. One is geopolitical competition is heating up. The global balance of power, the international order as we know it, is changing. The rise of China by itself will lead to a transformative change in the global balance of power and in the international system. That presents opportunities, of course, but it also poses challenges to our security, to our democracies, to our resilience. And ultimately, when we try to deal with these challenges as allies, together we're much and far stronger and far more able to stand up and protect our values, defend our democracies, and support the international rule-based order upon which our freedom and prosperity has been predicated for over 7 decades. This is a very, I think, important and simple fact. When allies through NATO decide to do something together, they're representing almost 1 billion people, and half of the world GDP, and half of the world military might. That means that what we say, when we say it together, really matters and will matter. And this will be even more important when we're facing with this changing balance of power. And that's, I think, it's a fundamentally crucial issue to keep in mind as we look at the future of the transatlantic relations. I think it will continue because it makes fundamental sense for us to continue to work together. If we decide to break apart, we will be much weaker. And no single ally, not even the United States, can deal with global systemic competition by itself. On top of it, it's not just about systemic competition, it's also about the threats and the challenges we face to our security. These challenges do not know borders. We cannot deal with it only nationally. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it perfectly clear that we may raise walls, we may shut down our communities, we may try to isolate ourselves, but the problems that we have and the challenges we face certainly do not stop at our borders. This is true for terrorism, it's true for hybrid warfare, it's true for cyber attacks, it is true for climate change. All these issues can only be confronted if we work together as countries. So again, very simply, we don't have the luxury to not work together. And I think that's especially true when we look at the next 10 years. I keep going on about this next 10 years because, of course, where I'm sitting here in Brussels at NATO, we are thinking at how do we adapt our alliance for the next decade. That's a process that we call NATO 2030, and we're now very much in the midst of this reflection. And there's a lot of important issues that we're trying to tackle, but I think the overarching principle is really the one I just tried to present in 5 minutes, and that is that we are a regional alliance. We are about the protection and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, but the challenges we face are increasingly more global and increasingly more require us to work together. And this is true, again, when it comes to dealing with the rise of China. It is true when it comes to dealing with the security impact of climate change. It is true when it comes to dealing with terrorism. And we are working more and more closer together to find common solutions to these problems. I see my time is basically up, but I just wanted to go back to the basics because sometimes, especially as we are having very important foreign policy debate about what is the right balance between looking inwards and looking outwards, and there are across the world, I think, also very strong feelings and temptations that ultimately it's better to look at our own garden, attend at our own garden and disengage. I think my point is that this may be appealing in theory, but in practice it's much harder to do in a world that is more global, more interconnected, and when ultimately our own way of life is predicated upon maintaining the international order as we know it. Think about whether you really believe it's possible to keep prosperity in a world in which you cannot trade freely. Is it really possible to keep open societies and democracy in a world in which autocracy is the norm? My answer is that it would be incredibly difficult, and that's why ultimately alliances matters, foreign policy matters, and international cooperation with those who share our values and interests is more relevant than ever. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Benedetta, for this analytical and hopeful vision for the future of the transatlantic relationship. Next is Professor James Shea.
So thanks very much. And like my fellow panelists, I'd like to start by thanking you and the colleagues so much for inviting me sorry, I disconnected my video. The problem with this online world is you've always pressed the wrong button at the wrong moment. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join you today. Am I there or am I not there?
You're here, we can see you. And
you can see me, excellent,
well.
Thank you. I'm sort of nostalgic for the days when it was possible to go to the United States without filling in 15 forms, having 3 COVID-19 tests before you leave them after you arrive, and quarantining yourself in a hotel for 2 weeks. I never got to Colorado, and in retrospect, I should have been bolder. Sorry, bad joke. But let me say that I'm immensely impressed on a Friday afternoon that I see from my bar at the bottom, over 100 participants are there. So this is one of the rare Zoom occasions that I've experienced of late. We're all suffering, as you know, from Zoom fatigue, where there are more people in the audience than on the panel. And I tell you, in Brussels on a Friday afternoon, achieving that result would be extremely difficult. So I'm really pleased to be here. Now, I was at NATO, as you rightly said, Svet, thank you, for 38 years. And my default DNA position is to immediately talk about NATO. But Benedetta is there today, lucky her, and has done it much better than I can. And since I retired from NATO, 2 years ago, I've been much more focused on the EU being down in the centre of Brussels. And so in order to not simply say what Benedetta said, I thought that I would sort of take the angle from the other side of town. As you know, there are two big beasts in Brussels, but also two big beasts of Western security policy, NATO and the EU. And so looking at the EU perspective is just as important, of course, for the solidity of the transatlantic relationship as the vibrant and forward-leaning NATO that Benedetta described. Now, a couple of days ago when Biden was inaugurated, I think there were as many people tuned in for the inauguration ceremony and the speech, incredibly eloquent and moving, as many people in Europe as in the United States. I mean, as you know, Europeans would dearly love to be able to vote in American elections because there's the perception that they are as important for our future as they are for yours. And of course, there was a massive audible sigh of relief with Biden being inaugurated. But nonetheless, somebody who sort of, even in these COVID restricted times, as somebody who moves around Brussels a lot these days, I detect sort of three sort of basic sort of communities of thought. The first one are the people who've been traumatized by the spectacle of the 4 years of Donald Trump, because they believe that if America has gone off in a more populist nationalist direction, it can happen again. And they see very much the Trump base of 70 plus million voters who of course are not going to go away, who have remained active. And therefore they ask themselves, can we rely upon the United States? Could it happen again? Should we put all of our eggs in the American basket with the risk that in 4 years' time the pendulum is going to swing the other way? And this is a group of sort of European autarkists who believe that the only answer is for Europe to somehow forge its own separate third way between the US and China way in the world and defend its own interests. The second camp is the sort of nostalgic camp, which is, oh my God, it's great that Biden is elected. We can turn the clock back 10 or 15 years back to the good old days when we could rely upon the United States to bankroll our security, to provide all of the troops and nuclear weapons for our deterrence, to lead and fund the multinational institutions. And all we needed to do was to follow. I think, if I may say so, Svet, that I think one of the dangers for the incoming Biden administration is going to be to have to sort of counteract that impression that because, as the ambassador was saying, a very solid Atlanticist, Joe Biden, is back in the White House, somehow we are sort of, going to go back to the future, as it were. I don't think that's in the interest of President Biden. I don't think that's going to be his message, but it is producing a kind of mood of complacency in Brussels. We don't need to do anything more ourselves. The US is back. The third camp, which, as you will guess, I suppose already, which is the camp that I find myself in, which is to say that the world has changed. The US was somewhat absent from the international order, not completely. I think sometimes the Trump effect has been exaggerated, but largely absent for the last 4 years. Things have moved on, and we need to reinvent the transatlantic relationship in order to save it. I mean, one of my favorite books is, many of you will have read it, is The Leopard by Giuseppe Lampedusa, and in it, the Count famously says things must change to remain the same. So what therefore has to sort of change to remain the same in terms of a modernized transatlantic relationship? Well, I think the first thing is that clearly we need to have a much better quality of transatlantic dialogue on issues where we really do need to work together. I mean, Russia is clearly one. It's been much more assertive over the last 4 years in its hybrid warfare tactics, cyber attacks, interference in elections, its modernization of its nuclear arsenal, the threat that it poses to its neighboring states, its interventions in Libya and the Middle East. And we need a much more consolidated policy about how do we handle Russia. The authoritarians are deeply entrenched, whether we like it or not. We should never give up on democracy in places like Russia or China or Iran or elsewhere, but we have to recognize that it's not going to happen in the short term. Another issue, of course, is China, and Bernadette mentioned that. It's quite clear that we're going to be much more successful at dealing with China if we combine our resources representing 60% of global GDP with our fellow democracies than if we go it alone, particularly on trade policy, on human rights, and on everything else. I mean, clearly, in the case of China, containment by itself isn't going to work, but we've also learned that cooperation isn't going to work either. We need this balanced policy. And how do we handle that? Another thing, of course, is the endless wars, as many people in the United States have called them. Yes, I mean, nobody wants to stay in Afghanistan forever. And President Trump was on the verge of withdrawing the American forces there. But we've been in Afghanistan for the best part of 20 years, as we have in Iraq and in the Balkans and elsewhere. We've invested massively in trying to produce if not fully democratic, at least sort of solid representative institutions to help the cause of women's rights and so on. You know, we can't simply sort of cut and run away from all of that. So, you know, how do we not stay forever, but make sure that we preserve some of the stability? We need a transatlantic dialogue on that urgently as well. And then the final area I would point to is clearly this area of technology. If we're going to really deal with the Chinese challenge, we can't have a situation where the US and the European Union cannot agree on common data privacy rules, on exchanges of data, on the regulation of social media companies, on social media taxation, on technology standards, 5G and so on. We need to create a transatlantic technology space where we, in Europe and the United States, have things to contribute to each other. So that's the first thing. We really have to see if Biden steps up on the transatlantic dialogue. The second thing, very briefly, and I'm sorry to use a buzzword here, but it's unavoidable, is European strategic autonomy. I mean, the last 4 years have seen the EU make a concerted push to try to stand on its own 2 feet, or its own 27 feet, 27 members, particularly by pooling its defense budgets and resources. The EU has launched 16 different security missions in Africa and the Middle East. And sometimes the United States sort of poo-poos that a little bit, and I can understand why, because the Europeans sometimes talk the talk before they really deliver on budgets and capabilities. And there are people in Washington who do see this as kind of undermining NATO. I don't think this is true. I think if the US looks at what the EU is trying to do in Africa and the Middle East or Ukraine, all of the missions benefit American security, like what France is doing in the Sahel at the moment. And I think that essentially there are a lot of things around the world where the US is not going to want to be engaged, but where Europe will be engaged. And therefore, what I would really hope under the Biden administration is we can have a kind of new transatlantic bargain. The US will start encouraging European strategic autonomy because they will see that as a form of European burden sharing, and vice versa. Frankly, the EU people will do a much better job of explaining in Washington how this is something which is really in the interest of the United States and will benefit American as well as European security. And then thirdly, and this is my final point, of course, Benedetta rightly, of course, because she's handling it, referred to this NATO reflection exercise. NATO will have a summit, probably, I don't know, in June, maybe Benedetta knows the date, I don't, but I'm certain that NATO will launch a new strategic concept looking at its future. It's got big issues to solve. How does it handle China? What is the balance of collective defense in Europe versus other types of activities elsewhere in the world, for instance? Does NATO deal with new challenges like climate change? And if so, in which meaningful way? But at the same time, the European Union is also starting or is continuing work on what it calls the strategic compass, where it's looking at how it can reinforce its role too on handling hybrid warfare challenges, dealing with cyber attacks, disinformation operations, improving its maritime posture, making its own missions much more effective through better mandates, better equipment, and so on. Now, to my mind, it would be a great pity that these 2 exercises run on parallel tracks and never meet. We need to put NATO and EU resources together. And so what I would really hope is that this strategic compass exercise can be dovetailed with the NATO new strategic concept based on Benedetta's NATO 2030, and we can come out of this with a much more joined up West, which of course, given the challenge of the authoritarians, we are going to need in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you all for this eye-opening initial remarks. I have a few questions for the panelists, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience as well. Winston Churchill once famously said, "We have no lasting friends, no lasting enemies, only lasting interests." Over the last 4 years, America's first policies stood in stark juxtaposition to many of the preferences and principles that the US has championed in the past. We pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, left the WHO in the midst of a pandemic, moved to limit free trade, criticized and pressured longtime allies in the UN and in NATO, sought to deepen relations with populist and authoritarian leaders around the world. Why this aggressive realignment in the US's Weltanschauung or outlook for the world now? What is the utility of this, if any? Is the 21st century calling for a reevaluation of the alliances and the policies of the past? And even if the new administration is to reverse some of these positions instantaneously, as we are observing these days, what might we be missing if we return to business as usual after 4 years of Trump? And the question is directed to all of you.
Yeah, let me just jump in. Look, I think, the United States, uniquely among the great powers in human history, it has been successful because we've been able to develop a global network of alliances. So, yes, the United States has been an extremely powerful country, but its ability to really influence the world has been significantly enhanced by this global network of alliances in Europe, in Latin America, in the Middle East, throughout the Asia-Pacific region. And that has benefited the American people in terms of enhancing the security of the United States, but also in creating prosperity, because America fundamentally is a trading nation. Even though we have a very large GDP, we trade with the entire world and we're invested. I mean, the US is the largest investor in the world, larger than China by a significant amount. If we may not be the largest trading nation, but also foreign investment in the United States. I mean, I think last year, for the first time, there was more foreign direct investment in China than the United States. But I think that that's an aberration, because of COVID. I mean, the United States very soon will regain as the preferred spot for investment. So the reality is that the United States must be part of the world, and its success must be, completely linked to its alliance structure. Now, the world has changed in the last 4 years, and there are things that are not going to be the same. I mean, look, clearly, President Trump, in my view, was a disastrous foreign policy president, but there were certain issues that he brought to the fore that are relevant and are going to continue to be relevant. So I think certainly one is China. I mean, while President Trump may have handled China in a very blunt way, no doubt China over the last 4 years it's more evident that they're becoming the threat side of China is more evident. And we've seen that in terms of China's actions in Hong Kong, in terms of the kind of military exercises that we've seen China undertake all around Taiwan, their very aggressive behavior in the South and East China Sea. So clearly, we can't go back to the Obama-China strategic dialogue. I mean, I think it is going to be, a post-Trump China relationship, but it's something that we're going to have to deal with. Now, that doesn't mean that what I expect, for example, on China, which is very much an issue that, as I said, President Trump brought to the fore, I think that you'll find that the Biden administration will try to lower the decibels and try to restore a dialogue with China and maybe find some strategic issues where we can be cooperative with China. Climate change would be a great example. We both have a huge stake in global climate change. And then, I would mention, Russia is another example. Again, Trump, while he may have taken some tough actions on Russia regarding sanctions and the like, his message was one of tolerance. He was one of tolerance of the repression in Russia, trying to understand, going a long way to understand Putin. I think you're going to find the Biden administration a lot tougher on Russia regarding the situation of human rights in Russia. Yet at the same time, so they'll be tougher. But at the same time, I think you'll find that the Biden administration will be seeking to restore cooperation on strategic issues. Nuclear weapons would be one of them. So, with that, I'll stop. But I think some things will change and some things will remain the same.
Thank you, Ambassador. Benedetto, Jamie, would you like to address this? Jamie, go ahead.
Very briefly, I guess give Benedetto time to warm up over there. My sense is that it's a false dichotomy to put interests on the one side and values on the other. The fact of the matter is that values and interests, in my mind, nearly always go together. For example, you believe in democracy as a value, but if you deal with democratic allies, you have allies who believe in the rule of law. And therefore there is protection for your investments. Your businessmen don't get arrested at 6 o'clock in the morning. Your companies don't suddenly find themselves facing trumped up tax charges overnight. The countries where you invest, if they're democracies, don't steal your intellectual property. We could go on and on and on, but to my mind, partners of the democracies also are much better at serving your interests. They go with you to Afghanistan after 9/11. They go with you to Iraq. They support you in the United Nations or in the things that you're trying to do around the world. They're often, your best sources of foreign investment and jobs and all of the rest. So I think you can perfectly well make a case, particularly if you look at transatlantic business trade flows compared with American investments and trade with the rest of the world. There's a Professor Dan Hamilton at Johns Hopkins University who's been tracking this for many, many years. So often, you will tend to find that business interests will correlate with value. So that's the first thing. I think it's, I'm not saying but I think generally, to suggest that somehow, you're sacrificing your interests because you go in favor of your values is just dead wrong. Secondly, authoritarians, obviously we want to have a productive dialogue. We don't want confrontation for confrontation's sake. Clearly, yes, we want to engage them where we can on global issues like China with climate change. Russia, we've had a productive dialogue on terrorism. There are things where we face common threats. Russia also sent ships to the Gulf of Aden to deal with pirates a couple of years ago. They don't like pirates any more than we do. So yes, you should sort of reach out and cooperate, but let's not have any illusions. Authoritarians don't like us. It's the fact they are trying to undermine us, to divide us, to weaken us. When they think, that we're distracted with the COVID crisis, they clamp down on their Uyghur minority, or they suddenly impose a draconian security law on Hong Kong and arrest hundreds of people. They start threatening Taiwan with military action and so on. We must not have any illusions that authoritarian states are not interested ultimately in any kind of permanent peace or settlement with the West. Again, I'm not suggesting that we pursue confrontation for its own sake, but we have to go into that with our eyes wide open, and we have to realize that it takes unity of the West in order to have an impact on their behavior. I think, and I come finally to what the ambassador said about Trump. I wrote an article the other day on Trump's foreign policy saying that its bark was worse than its bite. And I think there's some truth in that matter. I think Trump asked the right questions about the effectiveness of multilateralism, about dealing with the rise of China, about burden sharing with the European allies. These were good questions. I don't necessarily think that he provided the right answers. And I think the challenge for the Biden administration is not to change the question, but to try to come up with more effective answers. Because although he said ultimately his aim was to reach out to authoritarians and have good relations, at the end of the day, he achieved almost nothing, with Iran, with China, in Russia, in that regard. The other thing I'd just say finally, and I'll stop, but one of the things that also I've written a lot about with Trump was that the Trump administration was rather different from Trump. The Trump Pentagon's attitude towards NATO was very different from the president himself. And I think one of the challenges of the Biden administration is to get the president fully joined up in policy terms with his administration so that they're all rowing the boat in the same direction. I don't think that was always the case during the Trump years.
Benedetto, would you like to chime in for a second? I want to leave time for other questions as well, but I obviously want to give you the opportunity to address this.
What about, how about you ask another question so then we give a little bit more time for those who have questions, and maybe I can combine if needed.
That would be great. The future is Asian, famously said geopolitical strategist Parag Khanna. But the US is unlikely to simply cede global power to whoever might be next in line. What relationship must the US seek with its key challenger and regional superpower in Asia, China? And also with its old mortal enemy from the days of the Cold War, but perhaps a possible useful counterweight to Chinese dominance in Asia, Russia. Can we ever be anything more than competitors, rivals, or enemies with these two nations? If yes, at what cost? Benedetto, you have priority here.
Fine, sure, I'll start. There is a lot packed into your question, so let me see if I can unpack it, starting from the last question you asked, which is, can we ever be something else than have a conflictual or on a relationship that is more based on tension? And I think I want to slightly challenge that premise, because I think we have. I'm looking here at what happened after the end of the Cold War, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the geopolitical balance of power yet again shifted dramatically. And what happened in Europe? What happened with NATO? Well, many things. One is that former adversaries, former enemies that were behind the Iron Curtain finally were able to freely choose their own destiny and choose their own to fulfill their own Euro-Atlantic aspirations. And from former enemies, and of course they were enemies not by their own choice, but by the fact of being under a foreign influence and occupation, but by their own choice they decided to join NATO and become part of the alliance, which was also, of course, a step towards becoming members of the European Union, and more importantly for all of us, I think a step towards for them to fulfill their own self-determination, their own national aspirations. So that already was a great change in relations. But even more, I think we shouldn't absolutely forget that after the fall of the Soviet Union, our relationship with Russia fundamentally changed. And for many years, we did work together and we did strive to build a partnership. We built a NATO-Russia Council, we built a mutual dialogue, we started working together, and we absolutely made it clear that that was the intention, and that was the ideal, that was the trajectory. The fact that the relationship with Russia right now is at the lowest that it has been since the end of the Cold War is a direct consequence of Russia's behavior in recent years, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, of Russia's interference in our elections, of constant provocative actions along our borders. Will NATO allies, will European and North American allies want to resume and improve relations, absolutely, this is the message that NATO sends to Russia on a daily basis. But it is conditional upon Russia's behavior. It is conditional upon complying with international law. It is conditional upon its actions, and I think that is really important. It is not a predetermined fact that our relationship needs to be conflictual, not at all. And so that would be my reaction to this sort of framing that we've always been in a conflictual relationship. We have not. After '89, for many years, we have tried and we made great stride. But then Russia changed its behavior. And when it comes to China, I think the question is very much open. Jamie just laid out what all the complexities are and the difficulties, the impossibility of thinking about a complete disaggregation of our economies or a complete separation of us and China, the difficulty of believing in a new containment type of arrangement, but the difficulty of finding a balance. And I think, and I'll end here because there's so much to say, but I want to give the other panelists a chance to do so. I would just also caution against the idea that because we might have a challenge with China, that we should try to see Russia as a potential counterweight. I don't particularly see that way. These are my personal opinion, not representing NATO or anybody else, but I would more think about what are the political systems, the values, and the way of life we all champion, and how. And I think there is a clear systemic difference here in the type of political system we support, the type of international order we want to see. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have confrontation, but I also think we have to be open. We have to have our eyes wide open to those differences and understand that those matter, and clearly will stand in the way of having a instantaneous rapprochement. So I will put it that way.
Thank you, Benedetta. I want to ask some questions from the audience as well, but before I do that, of course, let's give the chance to the ambassador and to Jamie to chime in here.
Look, I'll be very quick. I think Benedetta really answered that question extremely well. I would just say that I honestly don't see sort of a Russia card to be played there with China at this time, although clearly China in some way represents a threat to Russian interests. If you go, in the east, in Siberia, I mean, there is an asymmetry there that suggests that there's potential tension and conflict, strategic tension and conflict. But at the end of the day, policy in Moscow is driven by Putin, and it's the point that Jamie made that it really is about his be all and end all is to stay in power, and this is where he sees that commonality of interest with the Communist Party in Beijing. And so what I see is ultimately there will be strategic, while you have two authoritarian regimes in Moscow and Beijing, you will see strategic cooperation to be as disruptive as they can to the West. So that's kind of the way I look at it. And one final quick point on China. While the Biden administration needs to reaffirm to the Chinese, that the United States will stand by its security obligations and by our allies, in Japan, we do have security obligations with regards to Taiwan, to the Taiwanese people. Extremely complex issues, but that's a first stage. But it's not just about dealing with China, in terms of, again, some type of containment strategy. It's that the United States have a more proactive approach vis-a-vis the Asia-Pacific. I mean, under the Trump administration, we really withdrew from this region, which is the fastest growing economic region, the most dynamic in the world. And again, the President Trump's decision very early on in his administration to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement, which we had concluded, which again, here was the United States leading the Asia-Pacific community in establishing a rules-based trading and investment regime, really 21st century trading investment regime that would have put pressure on China to abide by a rules-based system. And we walked away. And that has been a real blow to the United States. So I think for the Biden administration is not just keeping an eye on China, but re-engaging the region in a positive and constructive way so we can provide leadership once again.
Thank you.
If I may, very briefly, because your questions are very good, Svet. You know, what got us through the Cold War, and I like Benedetta's historical analogy in dealing with, you know, difficult partners, or even in those days, totalitarian states, were sort of three things. I mean, first of all, we made sure we had secure defenses, that we were able to push back against hostile or aggressive behavior, that we didn't allow ourselves to be divided or polarized, clearly, it was called containment in those days. Maybe that's a term we don't want to use today. But clearly, we settled down for the long haul. We recognized that, you know, we can't democratize other countries. That only the Russian people or the Chinese people can grasp democracy themselves, and that may take a long time. As I mentioned, these authoritarian regimes are deeply entrenched. Putin has, you know, just had a referendum to allow himself to stay in power until the mid-2030s. President Xi has done something similar in China, so that he is now president for life, and so on. I mean, but on the other hand, you know, I didn't predict the Berlin Wall coming down in November 1989. I don't think anybody else did. You know, history does, you know, sometimes produce changes for the better, and not just nasty shocks to these systems. And we should never, ever, ever give up on the notion, as Benedetta rightly said, that we can have another Russia. We did have another Russia for a number of years, and that we can have democracy in those countries. I won't accept the narrative that, you know, somehow these countries are always condemned to sort of be authoritarian states. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, you know, to cooperate where we can in mutual interest. Even, you know, when the Soviet Union was threatening us with thousands of nuclear weapons, we had arms control agreements, we had hotlines, and the rest. And today, you know, you could see with China, for example, Svet, that we need to do that when it comes to space weapons, cyber attacks, of course, important. We need also, you know, again, to get into the business of nuclear arms control, because we're now dealing with, you know, short-range nuclear weapons, lower yield warheads, hypersonic missiles, new generations of cruise missiles. So we need diplomats to work on that. And then thirdly, you know, what got us through the Cold War is that, you know, we were able to get our message into the populations inside these countries with a message of democracy, of human contact, of reliable news. It wasn't always easy. And today, you know, I hope that, notwithstanding all of our differences with Putin or President Xi, we can have Russian students and Chinese students in our universities. I know in the United States, there's been a big debate about Chinese students and to what degree they're going to go home with suitcases full of intellectual property secrets. I realize that there are security implications, but I think one of the best things that we can possibly do is make sure that we're opening fully to their societies and their peoples. It's not going to have any immediate impact, but in the long run, it at least keeps the spirit of pluralism and democracy alive.
Thank you, Jamie. We have 12 minutes, so I want to cover some questions from the audience. For the first question, I'm actually going to combine three questions from Michael, Mike, and Arthur. What do you see in the next 10 years for the world's nations addressing climate change? Michael asks. Then Arthur gives a spin to the same question by introducing the US's New Green Deal initiative or possibility, and how will this affect NATO's approach to global climate change? And finally, Mike also asks, okay, climate change cannot be something that the US and with this transatlantic relationship can tackle alone. What can we do to bring others on board to more effectively deal with this challenge and other international global challenges? So what to expect in the next 10 years? What's the role of the Green New Deal in this, and how do we bring other people on board? Jamie?
I'm sorry to come in again. I promise I'll be brief, but I deal a lot with this at the moment. So I've got some thoughts. I mean, the first thing, of course, is to recognize that we can deal with it. I mean, for example, this year or last year, 2020, was the year when renewables became cheaper than fossil fuels. I mean, technology, like with the COVID vaccine, has been moving at an incredible pace. You know, we now have electric trains. We're going to have electric cars. Battery power is improving. So we do have the solution to green our economies. And far more jobs are being created in this sector these days than in the old coal mining and fracking industry. So have confidence in the technological revolution. That's the first thing. Secondly, to recognize that for some years, Svet, unfortunately, we're going to be dealing with a kind of double challenge. On the one hand, mitigation. We've got to continue to get that greenhouse gas emissions down. And some people like John Kerry are talking about Glasgow, the COP26, the next big climate conference, as being the last chance really to get seriously binding commitments. It's also going to mean, unfortunately, that the West is going to have to give billions of dollars to the developing countries as an incentive to help them to make that transition. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. And on the other hand, as you know, Svet, from the United States, with forest fires in California and flooding in Texas and more hurricanes sweeping in than ever before, we're going to unfortunately be dealing with some of the consequences of past global warming in terms of extreme weather events and the need. NATO has been looking at this from a military perspective, what we can do to try to make our infrastructure, our roads, our towns, more robust against extreme weather events, and so that's the next thing that we're going. I think that we have to do to deal with this thing. But in the main, unfortunately, COVID to some degree has overshadowed all of this. I think this year, if we can get out of the COVID crisis as quickly as we can, we're going to have more time to devote to it. But the real problem, and I think for Biden, is that the winners are all long term, but the losers are all short term. Coal miners in West Virginia today, not very happy about what Biden announced the other day with his executive orders and the notion that subsidies are going to disappear or they can't drill. So how politically do you handle the short-term discontent today so that you can reap the long-term benefits of the transition over a period of 10 or 20 years? So it's really going to be an exercise in very good salesmanship and political communication.
Thank you, Jamie. Ambassador or Benedetto?
Yeah, look, I think that very much agree with everything Jamie said. I think that the Green New Deal is not going to be something that's really going to fly with our Congress. It just, I think that candidate Biden made very clear that that was not his approach. But I think that what you have is a big commitment to the Paris climate change and implementing what was agreed in Paris. And I think this is where, with Secretary Kerry's role, he'll play a huge role in working with our allies, in putting pressure on the Chinas to ensure that to invest the resources that are needed, as Jamie mentioned, in the third world, so that we can mitigate climate change. But I would say that, I've spoken to President Biden about this. When he was vice president, he visited us in Australia and had a chance to talk to him a little bit about the climate change issue. And he looks at it in a very sort of positive way, the way he is. And he very much believes in investing in clean technology. So he has very much this idea that the government creates the regulatory framework, but the technology exists so that we can dramatically move away from a carbon-based economy. So I think that you're going to see that, an unprecedented investment in the United States in cleaner technologies. The coal industry is pretty much dead in America. Whatever you hear in West Virginia, if you look at it broadly, coal is pretty much, nearing the end. But what's rising is wind. It's solar. It's more efficient use of energy. And that's going to be, I think, the real focus of the Biden administration.
Thank you, Ambassador Benedetto.
I'll be very quick because I think we're running out of time, but just to give a little a little point about what we are trying to do through NATO, as NATO, on this issue, because I think it answers some of the questions that I've seen in the chat. And to try to be as brief as possible, we are working right now on a climate and security agenda that looks exactly at that. It looks at how, first of all, it looks at climate change like the existential security issue it is. It looks at climate change as a security issue. He recognizes that climate change is a security threat. It is making our world more unstable. It is making our missions and operations more complex. It is creating a number of really transformative it has a transformative impact, and we need to acknowledge its seriousness. So first of all, that's, I think, also very important as a political message from a military alliance, that we say we see it. But we don't just see it. We're also working on how do we, first of all, how do we adapt? How do we adapt the way we train, we exercise, we plan? How do we adapt our armed forces? How do we make sure that our military installations are protected? How do we climate-proof everything we do? How do we enhance our climate resilience? So this is really a mainstream effort to look at the impact of climate on our security. But we're not just doing that. We're also looking at what can we do to mitigate. In other words, of course, NATO as a political military alliance will never be on the front line of this. However, and this is something the Secretary General of NATO said, everybody, every organization has to play its part. So we're also looking at what can we do, what can our militaries do to contribute to reaching net zero. So we're really working on the two tracks, the mitigation and the adaptation. And I think I just wanted to make that clear that of course we're working on it, and of course we recognize its important, and I really expect quite a lot of progress in the next year. So just to end on a slightly more positive note, saying that yes, there are things we can do, and we're looking very carefully at how we can do them and do them fast.
Benedetta?
I stopped talking a few seconds ago.
Okay, can you hear me? It was my turn to have some internet issues. Okay, so we have just 4 minutes, so I'll ask you one question, which I think would be a good platform to serve as the opportunity for each of you to make their closing remarks in about 45 seconds to a minute. And it's a question from Janelle. She asks, what are some real-world issues that can be addressed in the next 2 years where there could be real cooperation that would appeal to even people who are not diplomatically oriented or cooperation oriented? Something that is obvious that many people will be on the same side and that needs to be addressed quickly. So 1 minute, each of you.
I'll chime in 1 minute. I'll bring an issue that I consider a global issue, and that is the issue of Afghanistan. You know, again, people know this is a very controversial issue with the forever wars, but I do believe that this isn't, that Afghanistan has an opportunity right now of potentially achieving a political settlement, but it's imperative for the United States, NATO, all of the allies, the United Nations, the global community, to work over the next year or so to ensure that we remain in Afghanistan, we maintain our commitment to the people of Afghanistan, and all that's been achieved there, the positive that's been achieved in terms of women's rights, in terms of democratic governance, freedom of press and assembly. So that commitment to Afghanistan remain, but in a way that ultimately leads to a political settlement. So the discussions, the discussions that are going on in Afghanistan between the government and the Taliban, that we can get ultimately we can get a successful outcome.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Yeah, I can go in 45 seconds and give Benedetta the last word. I mean, there's a lot of things you can mention. I would, of course, climate change we've spoken about already because it does affect everybody increasingly. I could mention avoiding the militarization of space because we all depend upon satellite communications for everything these days, including climate monitoring. But the issue that really concerns me the most is the identification and the recognition of truth. It's this paradox that never before we had so many laptops and iPhones and pads and different ways of accessing data and information and communication. And never before have we started to sort of all live in bubbles, ideological bubbles, where we only believe what we want to believe and we discount everything as disinformation and fake news. Let's be honest, you've had this problem in a major way in the United States with QAnon and these kind of groupings, sort of giving people the impression that the end of the world is nigh, and highly educated, college-educated people believing all of these conspiracy theories. We have it also in Europe, and it's very much behind populism, and it's also something that authoritarians with their bots and their trolls are going to exploit against us. And so I suppose there are two big questions. How do we benefit from the communications revolution, but in a way that educates us and allows us to agree on the facts? You had in the United States an unbelievable good Supreme Judge a few years back called Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he said everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but everybody is not entitled to their own facts. And my sense is that if we can't agree on the facts in our democracies, we're not going to have democracies. So in respecting freedom of speech, of course, and different opinions, that's part of democracy, how do we create a kind of media space so that we can at least agree on what's true and what's not and what isn't? I don't know. Regulating the social media companies, it's all part of it, but it's a much deeper problem. Supporting the independent media, but I think that's going to be the biggest problem of the 21st century, quite frankly, because democracy ultimately depends upon it.
Thank you, Jamie. Benedetta, you have the last word.
Well, I mean, it's a great question. And the reality is that the type of security threats and the type of problems we face today are hardly ever solvable alone. That's the reality, be it when it comes to tackling climate change, be in regulation of space. Who owns it? Who regulates it? Be in cyberspace. How do you deal with disinformation? How do you keep the internet free and open? How do you protect freedom of speech? How do you protect your data? How do you regulate new and emerging technologies? All of these things cannot be done just nationally. It just doesn't work. So even if it would be much easier if we could just build a high wall and fence ourselves in, it just won't work. So the truth is that virtually everything that is a big problem today requires global cooperation to tackle it. And I stop here.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and a special thank you to our speakers who have volunteered their time to be with us today. If you would like to support them and learn more about their work, you can find their books, podcasts, and social media accounts linked to our CWA website. Preparations are already underway for CWA 2021. I guess what we had today was CWA 2020. And CWA relies on the generosity of people like you to make this event possible. Please consider making a gift to the CWA, which can be done on the CWA website. And if you enjoyed the panel today, you can watch the previous two panels in our International Affairs series on climate change and the future of China, available on the CWA YouTube channel. With that, thank you all again, and everybody have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you.